Mazda once survived the unthinkable. 2 miles from the center of Hiroshima's destruction, the company rebuilt itself from rubble, then spent decades turning impossible ideas into rolling proof that small automakers could still matter. This was the company that took the rotary engine, a concept almost everyone else had abandoned, and made it real. This was the company that built its identity around refusing to follow the herd. But now, in 2026, Mazda is facing a kind of threat that engineering courage cannot solve by itself. Profits have collapsed. Sales are falling across nearly every major model exposed to import tariffs. Federal regulators have warned owners of key SUVs not to drive them until a steering defect is fixed. And after Mazda's first electric vehicle failed in America, then failed again in Europe, the company is now relying on a Chinese partner to build the electric future it could not create quickly enough on its own. That sounds like 5 different disasters: tariffs, sales declines, recalls, a failed EV strategy, a dependence on outside help. But the real story is bigger than Mazda. It is the end of an era for independent Japanese automakers, because Mazda's crisis reveals something brutal about the modern car industry. The qualities that made these companies admired for generations, independence, engineering pride, and the ability to do more with less, are now being tested by a world where scale matters more than personality. And the question is no longer whether Mazda can build great cars. It can. The question is whether great cars are enough when the business around them is turning into a war of attrition. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what Mazda represents. Toyota sells more than 10 million vehicles a year around the world. It has factories everywhere, cash everywhere, hybrid technology refined over decades, and enough scale to absorb shocks that would crush a smaller company. Honda has a huge global footprint and a deep technology bench. Nissan, even with all of its problems, has spent years tied into an alliance with Renault and Mitsubishi. Mazda is different. Mazda sells roughly 1.2 million vehicles globally. Compared with Toyota, that is not just smaller, it is a different universe. And for a long time, that smallness was not a weakness. It was the soul of the brand. Mazda could not outspend the giants, so it tried to outthink them. It made cars that felt more expensive than they were. A Mazda 3, a CX-5, even a simple compact crossover could deliver soft-touch interiors, clean design, sharp steering, and a sense of driver connection that rivals often treated like an afterthought. It was never quite a luxury brand, never quite a bargain brand, but something in the middle. Affordable luxury with an enthusiast heartbeat. That is why Mazda built such a loyal following. People did not just buy a Mazda because the spreadsheet made sense. They bought one because it felt like somebody inside the company still cared about how a car moved, how the wheel loaded up in a corner, how the cabin made a daily commute feel a little less ordinary. That is rare, but rare does not always mean safe. Because when the ground shifts under the entire industry, a small independent company does not have as many places to hide. And in 2026, the ground did not simply move, it split open. The first crack was tariffs, and the numbers are ugly. For the first half of Mazda's fiscal year 2026, running from April through September, the company posted an operating loss of 53.9 billion yen, more than $350 million. For the full fiscal year, ending in March 2026, global sales volume fell to 1.223 million vehicles, down 6% year over year. Operating income collapsed 72%. Net income dropped 69%. That is not a soft landing. That is more than 2/3 of the profit base disappearing in 1 year. The biggest hit came from the tariff trap. In 2025, the Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on imported vehicles, with Japanese-built vehicles facing a blend of 27.5% and 15%, while Mexico-built vehicles were hit with a 25% tariff. Every Japanese automaker felt the pressure. But Mazda was uniquely exposed because it does not build most of its American lineup inside the United States. The CX-5, CX-70, and CX-90 come from Japan. The CX-30 and the Mazda 3 sedan come from Mexico. So when the tariff wall went up, Mazda did not just face a pricing problem, it faced a structural problem. The company told investors that U.S. tariffs alone cost it 97.1 billion yen in profit in just the first half of the year. That is not a rounding error in a quarterly report. That is the kind of number that changes the entire business plan, and because Mazda cannot spread that pain across 10 million annual sales, the damage shows up fast. The company cut production. Wholesale volume dropped 8% in the first half of the fiscal year because selling more cars under those conditions could mean selling more unprofitable cars. That is the quiet horror of this situation. Mazda was not simply losing sales because customers rejected the product. It was deliberately pulling back because the math of selling its own vehicles had turned against it. The American sales figures show what that retreat looks like in real time. Through the first 4 months of 2026, Mazda's U.S. sales were down more than 15% year-to-date. April alone fell 17.3%. The model breakdown is even more revealing. The Mexico-built CX-30 was down 56% for the year. The CX-70 was down 46%. The CX-90 was down 40%. At one point, even the Mazda 3 sedan suffered a monthly drop of nearly 59% compared with the year before. Only 2 vehicles in the U.S. lineup were growing, the CX-50 and the Mazda 3 hatchback. And the CX-50 tells the whole story. It is built in the United States at the Mazda-Toyota joint manufacturing plant near Huntsville, Alabama, which means it avoids most of the tariff exposure, destroying the rest of the lineup. CX-50 sales were up nearly 20% year-to-date. That is the paradox. The brightest part of Mazda's American business is the vehicle protected by a factory it shares with Toyota. The independent automaker's safest American bet is the one connected to a giant. Everything else, everything built by Mazda in Mazda's own overseas plants, is being squeezed by policy, geography, and scale. A bad tariff year is survivable for a giant. For Mazda, it becomes a test of the entire model. But sales pressure alone is not what makes this crisis feel so dangerous. Automakers go through rough cycles. Exchange rates move, governments change rules, inventory gets adjusted. The more painful part is that while the financial pressure was building, the vehicles Mazda needed most began running into serious quality and safety problems. And the timing could not have been worse, because the trouble centered on the CX-90 and CX-70, the SUVs Mazda was counting on to prove it could move up market and compete with 3-row family crossovers from Toyota, Honda, and Kia. The most alarming issue is the sticky steering problem. Federal regulators opened an investigation after owners reported steering that could suddenly become heavy, inconsistent, or unpredictable, sometimes at highway speeds. This is not a cosmetic defect. This is not a loose trim panel or a glitchy screen. Steering feel is one of the pillars of Mazda's identity, and when owners start saying the steering itself can change without warning, that cuts directly into the brand's core promise. The guidance around affected vehicles has been blunt. Do not drive them until the fix is completed. That kind of warning changes the emotional relationship between owner and machine. A Mazda is supposed to feel precise. It is supposed to feel trustworthy. It is supposed to make the driver feel connected. A sudden change in steering effort at speed does the opposite. It introduces doubt. And once doubt enters the ownership experience, loyalty becomes much harder to protect. Then came the fuel gauge recall. In September 2025, Mazda recalled more than 104,000 CX-70 and CX-90 vehicles because ethanol in the fuel could react with material inside the fuel sending unit. The result was a fuel gauge that might show a full tank even when the vehicle was actually empty. When the fuel ran out, the engine could stall, and in some cases it might not restart. Imagine a family SUV merging onto a highway, the gauge telling the driver everything is fine, and then power vanishing because the car was never as full as it claimed. That is not just inconvenient, that is dangerous. And it was not the only recall. In November 2024, Mazda recalled more than 80,000 CX-90 and CX-70 models because a faulty dashboard electrical unit could disable the defroster, the seatbelt warning chime, and the 360-degree camera when the vehicle started. Separately, nearly 39,000 CX-90s were recalled because the automatic idle stop system sometimes failed to restart the engine. Earlier in 2025, Mazda issued another recall covering more than 171,000 vehicles over an airbag concern that could prevent proper deployment in a crash. Add it up, and you are looking at hundreds of thousands of recalled vehicles in a short window, concentrated around the very SUVs that were supposed to carry Mazda's future in America. One recall can happen to anyone. 2 can be unfortunate. But when issue after issue clusters around the same nameplates, customers start asking a different question. They stop asking whether the brand had a bad batch. They start asking whether the brand stretched too far, too fast, without the backup systems bigger automakers use to absorb and correct mistakes before they become identity-level problems. For Mazda, that question hurts because engineering trust is not a side benefit. It is the brand. This is where the old independent spirit starts to collide with the new industrial reality. Mazda wants to be premium without being huge. It wants to build complex, upscale vehicles without charging luxury money. It wants to deliver driving feel, material quality, and design character while operating at a fraction of Toyota's scale. That balancing act can work when everything is stable. But modern vehicles are no longer simple mechanical products. They are rolling networks of sensors, software, emission systems, safety logic, cameras, hybrid components, and regulatory requirements. Complexity rewards scale. Every added system needs testing, validation, supplier control, software calibration, field monitoring, and fast recall response. Larger automakers can spread that cost over massive volumes. Smaller automakers have to carry the same basic burden with fewer units and thinner cushions. That does not mean Mazda is careless. It means the game has changed. The rotary era rewarded cleverness. The software and regulation era rewards armies of engineers, massive validation budgets, and global platforms that can amortize mistakes over millions of vehicles. Mazda's great gift has always been doing more with less. The danger now is that less is becoming less acceptable, and just as tariffs and recalls were exposing that pressure, the electric transition exposed another weakness. Mazda's first real EV attempt in the American market was the MX-30, launched in 2019. On paper, it gave Mazda a place in the electric conversation. In reality, it arrived compromised from the beginning. It had about 100 miles of range at a time when rivals were already pushing beyond 250 miles. It was sold only in California. It started north of $35,000, despite offering less range than a Nissan Leaf. It looked like an EV designed by a company still not fully convinced the EV market was ready. Customers noticed. Mazda pulled the MX-30 from the U.S. market after the 2023 model year, barely 2 years after it arrived. The death notice was short, almost painfully short. An entire American EV strategy ended in just a few sentences, but Mazda did not abandon the idea completely. In Europe, it kept selling a range extender version called the MX-30 REV, using a small rotary engine not to drive the wheels directly, but to generate electricity and stretch the range. As an engineering idea, it was fascinating. It connected Mazda's future to its past in the most Mazda way possible, using rotary technology, the same kind of contrarian thinking that once made the company famous, as a clever solution to electric anxiety. But clever is not the same as successful. In early 2026, Mazda quietly discontinued the MX-30 REV in Europe too, citing a combination of reasons, including shifting consumer trends. In plain language, the market still did not want it. So Mazda now faces the electric future without a successful in-house EV proving ground in the United States or Europe, and that is why the next step feels so symbolic. Mazda's next generation of electric models, including vehicles like the EZ6 and EZ60, is coming through a partnership with Chang'an, a Chinese automotive group. That may be the right move. It may even be the only sensible move. China's EV supply chain is fast, deep, and brutally competitive. Partnering can save money, speed up development, and give Mazda access to platforms and manufacturing knowledge it would struggle to build alone quickly enough. But symbolically, it is hard to ignore. The company that built its mythology around going its own way now needs help from one of the most aggressive EV ecosystems in the world. The brand that once made the impossible engine work is now trying to catch up by borrowing speed from someone else's machine. That does not make Mazda weak. It makes Mazda realistic, but it also marks a turning point. Independent Japanese automakers used to prove themselves by resisting the obvious path. In the electric era, resisting too long can leave you so far behind that partnership stops being optional. It becomes survival. And the rest of the industry is not waiting politely while Mazda figures it out. Chinese automakers are moving fast. Toyota is scaling hybrids and selectively pushing into EVs from a position of enormous strength. Honda has spent years building electrification capacity. Hyundai and Kia are attacking the market with dedicated EV platforms and aggressive pricing. Tesla reset customer expectations around software, charging, and acceleration. In that environment, an EV with 100 miles of range was not a quirky first step. It was evidence that Mazda was late to a race that had already changed speed, and when the second version also fails to find enough demand, the lesson becomes sharper. The company cannot simply rely on clever engineering character anymore. It needs scale, supply chain depth, battery expertise, software capability, and global execution. Those are expensive, they are slow to build, and Mazda is trying to build or borrow them while also absorbing tariffs and fixing recalls. That is the real squeeze. Not one bad decision. Not one unlucky year. A convergence. Put yourself inside Mazda's boardroom for a moment. You are trying to defend a brand built on premium feel and driving joy while telling investors that tariffs wiped out 97.1 billion yen of profit in half a year. You are trying to protect margins by cutting wholesale volume, knowing that every cut makes the company look smaller at the exact moment scale is becoming more important. You are trying to reassure loyal owners while regulators are telling some SUV owners not to drive their vehicles until a steering fix is complete. You are trying to present a confident electric future after the only EV you sold in America disappeared after barely 2 years, and the clever rotary range extender version in Europe disappeared too. Any one of those problems could be managed. Together, they become a stress test of independence itself, and this is why the title of this story is not simply The Trouble at Mazda. It is the end of independent Japanese automakers as we knew them, because Mazda is showing what happens when the old model meets the new rules. The old model said a smaller company could survive by being smarter, sharper, more focused, and more beloved. The new model says every automaker must fight tariffs, software complexity, battery costs, supply chain wars, safety investigations, emissions rules, and Chinese competition at the same time. In that world, affection is not enough. Brand loyalty is powerful, but it cannot erase a 25% tariff on Mexico-built vehicles. Steering feel is wonderful, but it cannot offset a do not drive warning. Rotary heritage is beautiful, but it cannot make a 100-mile EV competitive in a market already expecting 2.5 times that range. This is the painful contradiction. Mazda's identity is still valuable. The cars still have something many rivals lack. The CX-50's success proves that when Mazda is protected from tariff math, the product can still connect. Its loyal fanbase is real. Its design language is strong. Its driving character still matters. The company has responded with discipline, cutting volume to protect margins, leaning into the US-built CX-50 and hybrid variant, and using the Alabama plant more strategically instead of pretending pride can beat economics. Mazda has not panicked. It has not abandoned the brand. It is still projecting a return to profitability in the back half of the fiscal year. That matters. This is not a funeral, but it is a warning, because discipline can keep a small company steady, but it cannot magically create Toyota-scale protection. It cannot undo the fact that the safest American Mazda is built in a factory shared with a larger partner. It cannot erase the symbolic weight of needing Chang'an to accelerate the EV future. It cannot make repeated recalls vanish from the minds of families choosing between a CX-90, a Highlander, a Pilot, and a Telluride. The best version of Mazda can survive this. But the old romantic version, the idea that a proudly independent automaker can simply engineer its way around every structural disadvantage, is the part now under threat. So go back to the beginning. A company born near disaster, rebuilt through grit, and made famous by choosing the harder road, is now facing a challenge that is quieter than a bomb and less dramatic than a bankruptcy headline, but maybe more revealing. Tariffs expose the weakness of building too much outside the market where you sell. Recalls expose the risk of pushing complex new vehicles without a giant safety net. The failed MX-30 exposed the cost of moving too slowly into electrification. The Chang'an partnership exposed the truth that independence now has limits. And all of it points to the same conclusion. Mazda's problem is not that it forgot how to build cars people love. Mazda's problem is that love no longer protects a car company from a global industry designed around scale. That is why this story matters beyond one brand. It is a warning to every smaller automaker trying to stay distinctive in a market that increasingly punishes anyone without massive volume, massive capital, and massive technological depth. Maybe Mazda claws back from this with smarter production, better quality control, stronger hybrids, and EVs that finally land. Maybe the CX-50 becomes the template for a more realistic future, one where Mazda stays special by choosing partnerships carefully instead of pretending it can fight giants alone. Or maybe this is the start of something bigger, the moment when independent Japanese automakers stop being romantic underdogs and start becoming brands that must either partner, merge, or shrink into niches. That is the uncomfortable choice. Is Mazda's crisis just a brutal rough patch? Or is it proof that the age of the small independent Japanese automaker is ending? Drop your answer in the comments, because this debate is bigger than Mazda, and if you care about the future of cars with character, this is one of the most important questions in the industry right now.